Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we delve into a case that shocked the seaside town of Southport, England, in the late 1990s. It's a story of deception, manipulation, and a husband's chilling performance that fooled an entire nation for over 18 months. This is the story of Lindsay Quai, a young mother whose disappearance would become one of the most disturbing cases of spousal murder in British criminal history. As you settle in tonight, let this tale unfold slowly like the investigation itself, piece by piece, revelation by revelation, until the horrifying truth finally emerges from the shadows of lies and deceit. Christmas was approaching in Southport, England, in December of 1998. The seaside resort town, known for its Victorian elegance and windswept beaches, was preparing for the holiday season. But in one modest home, a tragedy was unfolding that wouldn't be discovered for months. Lindsay Quai was 21 years old, a petite woman with dark hair and a gentle demeanor. She was the mother of 2 young children and married to Mitchell Quai, a man 7 years her senior who worked as a casino croupier. To those who knew them casually, they appeared to be just another young family navigating the challenges of early parenthood and making ends meet in working-class England. But appearances, as we so often discover in these stories, can be devastatingly deceptive. Lindsay had grown up in care, never knowing the stability of a permanent family home. This background made her particularly vulnerable to manipulation, and it also meant that fewer people would immediately notice when she vanished from her daily routine. She had been in an abusive relationship with Mitchell, though the full extent of this abuse wouldn't become clear until much later. On what would be the final day of her life, Lindsay had plans that suggested she was trying to break free from her troubled marriage. She had been considering divorce, a fact that would later prove crucial to understanding the motive for what happened next. But she never got the chance to pursue that freedom. The last credible sighting of Lindsay Quai was in mid-December 1998. After that date, she simply vanished, as if she had walked out of her life and into the cold winter air, never to return. But the most chilling aspect of her disappearance wasn't the mystery of where she had gone. It was the fact that no one reported her missing for nearly 2 months. In most missing person cases, the alarm is raised within hours or days. Family members call when someone doesn't come home. Friends notice the absence at work or social gatherings. Children ask where their parent has gone. But in Lindsay's case, an eerie silence settled over her disappearance. A silence that was carefully orchestrated by the one person who should have been most concerned about her whereabouts. Mitchell Quai had explanations for everyone who asked about his wife. She had gone to visit relatives, he would say with a casual shrug. She needed some time away to think about things. She was dealing with personal issues, and would be back when she was ready. To the children, he offered similar reassurances, telling them that mommy had gone away for a while but would return. The days turned to weeks, and the weeks stretched toward months. Mitchell continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He went to work at the casino, dealt cards with steady hands, collected his wages, and returned home each evening to care for the children. Neighbors occasionally asked after Lindsay, but Mitchell's explanations seemed reasonable enough. After all, marriages go through difficult periods, and sometimes people do need space. It wasn't until February 1999, nearly 2 months after Lindsay's disappearance, that someone finally raised the alarm. A social worker, conducting a routine welfare check related to the children, noticed that Lindsay was nowhere to be found. When pressed for details about his wife's whereabouts, Mitchell's explanations seemed suddenly inadequate. The social worker, trained to recognize the signs of family dysfunction, sensed that something was deeply wrong. The official missing person report was filed on February 8, 1999. Lindsay Quai, mother of 2, had been missing for approximately 53 days before anyone in an official capacity even knew she was gone. When Detective Inspector Andy Brennan and his team at Merseyside Police began investigating Lindsay's disappearance, they immediately focused on the most obvious suspect, the husband. Statistics show that when women go missing under suspicious circumstances, their intimate partners are responsible in the vast majority of cases. Mitchell Quai knew this, and he seemed almost to relish the attention. From the very beginning, Mitchell presented himself as the grieving, confused husband. He spoke to police with apparent openness, inviting them into his home, showing them around, answering their questions with what seemed like genuine concern for his missing wife. He expressed worry about her state of mind, suggesting that she might have hurt herself or simply decided to start a new life somewhere else. The police began their investigation methodically. They searched the family home looking for signs of violence or struggle. They found nothing obvious, no blood, no evidence of a fight, no indication that anything terrible had happened within those walls. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and family members. Most people described Lindsay as a quiet, devoted mother who wouldn't simply abandon her children. But Mitchell had an answer for everything. He painted a picture of a troubled woman who had been struggling with depression and relationship difficulties. He suggested that she had been talking about leaving, about needing to find herself. He even showed police a note that he claimed Lindsay had left, though experts would later question its authenticity. As the investigation continued, detectives began to notice inconsistencies in Mitchell's story. Small details changed from one telling to the next. His timeline didn't always make sense, and there was something about his demeanor that didn't quite ring true. A performance quality to his grief that experienced investigators found troubling. What happened next would make this case unique in the annals of British crime. Instead of avoiding publicity, Mitchell Quai embraced it with an enthusiasm that was both remarkable and deeply disturbing. In what would become an 18-month campaign of self-promotion disguised as a search for his missing wife, Mitchell transformed himself from a suspect into a sympathetic public figure. He began appearing on television programs, giving interviews to newspapers, and cooperating with documentary filmmakers. His message was always the same. He was a devoted husband desperately searching for his beloved wife, and the police were wasting time by focusing on him instead of looking for the real answers. Mitchell's media appearances were masterfully crafted performances. He would look directly into the camera with tears in his eyes, pleading for Lindsay to come home. He spoke about how much the children missed their mother, how he lay awake at night wondering where she was, how he would never give up hope of finding her. He organized search parties, distributed missing person flyers, and created a public persona of a man consumed by grief and determination. The British public was captivated. Here was a husband who refused to give up, who was fighting against police incompetence to find his wife. Media outlets began portraying Mitchell as a sympathetic figure, even suggesting that the police investigation was misguided in its focus on him as a suspect. But what the public didn't know, what Mitchell knew every time he looked into those cameras and pleaded for his wife's return, was that Lindsay was never coming home. She couldn't come home. She was dead, killed by the very man who was now performing grief for the nation's entertainment. While Mitchell Quai was charming television audiences and newspaper readers with his apparent devotion to finding his wife, the police investigation was slowly and methodically building a case against him. Detective Inspector Brennan and his team knew they were dealing with something unusual, a suspect who seemed to be enjoying the attention his wife's disappearance was bringing him. The investigators began to focus on Mitchell's financial situation. They discovered that he had been cashing Lindsay's welfare checks since her disappearance, a detail that seemed inconsistent with his claims of believing she might return at any moment. When confronted about this, Mitchell had explanations, but they seemed increasingly strained. Police also began to examine Mitchell's behavior in the days immediately following Lindsay's disappearance. They discovered that he had been remarkably calm and composed, showing none of the frantic worry that might be expected from a husband whose wife had suddenly vanished. He had made no immediate attempts to contact her family or friends, had not filed a missing person report himself, and had seemed content to wait for someone else to notice that his wife was gone. The investigation expanded to include extensive searches of the local area. Police, volunteers, and search and rescue teams combed through parks, wasteland, and remote areas around Southport. They dragged ponds and searched abandoned buildings. All the while, Mitchell participated in these searches, sometimes leading groups of volunteers, always maintaining his performance as the desperate husband. What made these searches particularly chilling, investigators would later realize, was that Mitchell knew exactly where Lindsay was. He knew that the search teams were looking in all the wrong places. because he had put her somewhere they would never think to look. And he watched them search, offering suggestions and encouragement, all while knowing that their efforts were futile. By the summer of 1999, several months into the investigation and Mitchell's media campaign, experienced detectives began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. The performance that had seemed so convincing at first was beginning to show cracks around the edges. Mitchell's story had evolved over time, with details changing or being added that hadn't been present in his initial statements. His emotional responses seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. And perhaps most tellingly, he appeared to be enjoying the attention and publicity in a way that seemed inappropriate for someone genuinely grieving a missing spouse. Psychological profilers brought in to assess Mitchell identified traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and possible sociopathy. They noted his apparent lack of genuine empathy, his manipulative behavior, and his obvious pleasure in being the center of attention. The profile suggested that if Mitchell was responsible for his wife's disappearance, he would likely be unable to resist the temptation to insert himself into the investigation and to enjoy the drama he had created. Meanwhile, the investigation into Lindsay's background revealed a woman who was indeed unhappy in her marriage, but who was devoted to her children. Friends and family members, when pressed, admitted that they had been concerned about signs of abuse in the relationship. Some recalled instances where Lindsay had appeared with unexplained bruises or had seemed unusually subdued and fearful. The picture that emerged was of a controlling, manipulative husband and a wife who had been trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation. The fact that Lindsay had been considering divorce provided the motive that investigators had been looking for. As 1999 progressed into 2000s, the investigation took on new dimensions. Police began conducting more detailed forensic examinations of the Quai family home and property. They used luminol to check for traces of blood that might have been cleaned up, and they brought in specialist equipment to detect any signs that a crime had been committed on the premises. During this period, Mitchell's brother Elliot began to attract attention from investigators. Elliot was younger than Mitchell, easily influenced, and had been spending time with his brother around the period of Lindsay's disappearance. Police began to suspect that if Mitchell had indeed killed his wife, he might not have disposed of the body alone. The psychological pressure on Lindsay Quai began to mount as investigators repeatedly brought him in for questioning. Unlike his older brother, Elliot didn't have Mitchell's gift for manipulation or his apparent immunity to stress. The younger Quai brother began to show signs of strain as the months wore on. Meanwhile, Mitchell continued his media campaign with undiminished enthusiasm. He appeared on more television programs, gave more interviews, and even allowed documentary crews unprecedented access to his life and his search for his missing wife. This decision would later prove to be a crucial mistake, as cameras captured moments of behavior that psychological experts would identify as profoundly disturbing. In one particularly chilling sequence filmed for a documentary, Mitchell was shown discussing his wife's disappearance with what appeared to be genuine emotion. But careful analysis of the footage revealed microexpressions and behavioral cues that suggested he was performing rather than genuinely experiencing grief. His facial expressions didn't match his words, and his body language conveyed a sense of satisfaction rather than distress. The breakthrough in the case came in June 2000, nearly 18 months after Lindsay's disappearance. The constant pressure on Lindsay Quai had finally reached a breaking point, and the younger brother could no longer maintain the burden of the secret he had been carrying. In a moment of psychological collapse, Elliot broke down and confessed to police his role in helping his brother dispose of Lindsay's body. The revelation was both a relief to investigators who had always suspected Mitchell's guilt and a horrifying confirmation of just how calculated and cold-blooded the crime had been. According to Elliot's confession, Mitchell had killed Lindsay during an argument about her plans to leave him. The murder itself had been committed in a moment of rage, but what followed was a calculated cover-up that demonstrated Mitchell's complete lack of remorse or humanity. Mitchell had contacted his brother the day after the murder, claiming he needed help with a problem. When Elliot arrived at the house, he was confronted with the horrifying reality of what his brother had done. Instead of insisting they contact police, Elliot allowed himself to be drawn into the conspiracy. The two brothers spent hours dismembering Lindsay's body in the bathroom of the family home, using household tools and cleaning supplies. They then transported the remains to various locations around Southport, burying parts in different areas to make discovery less likely. With his brother's confession providing the crucial evidence they needed, police arrested Lindsay Quai on June 8, 2000. Faced with the detailed testimony of his brother and the mounting evidence against him, Mitchell finally abandoned his 18-month performance and confessed to the murder. But even in confession, Mitchell's narcissistic nature shone through. He spoke about the crime with a detachment that chilled experienced detectives. He described strangling Lindsay during an argument, but he showed no genuine remorse for his actions. Instead, he seemed almost proud of how successfully he had deceived the public and the media for so long. Mitchell's confession revealed the full horror of what had transpired. He had killed Lindsay in December 1998, then methodically planned the disposal of her body and the creation of his elaborate deception. Every television appearance, every newspaper interview, every tearful plea for his wife's return had been a performance by a man who knew exactly where she was and what had happened to her. The confession also revealed the psychological torture that Mitchell had inflicted on Lindsay's family and friends. For 18 months they had lived with hope that she might still be alive, that she might suddenly walk through their door or call to say she was safe. Mitchell had allowed them to maintain that hope while knowing it was false, seeming to take pleasure in their anguish. The trial of Lindsay Quai began in January 2001 and quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in recent British history. The case had captured public attention not just because of the brutal nature of the crime, but because of the unprecedented way the perpetrator had used the media to further his deception. Prosecutor opened the case by describing Mitchell as a manipulative sociopath who had committed the perfect crime, not in terms of avoiding detection, but in terms of turning his victim's murder into a platform for personal attention and sympathy. They argued that Mitchell had enjoyed every moment of his 18-month performance, reveling in the media attention and the public sympathy. The prosecution's case was built around several key elements: Elliot's testimony about helping to dispose of the body, forensic evidence from the family home, and psychological analysis of Mitchell's behavior during the investigation. They also presented evidence of the abuse Lindsay had suffered during her marriage, establishing both motive and a pattern of controlling behavior. Perhaps most damaging to Mitchell's case were the documentary recordings that he himself had authorized. Psychological experts testified that his behavior on camera was inconsistent with genuine grief or concern. His micro-expressions, body language, and vocal patterns all suggested that he was performing rather than experiencing authentic emotions. The defense attempted to portray Mitchell as a man driven to desperation by the investigation's focus on him, arguing that he had been forced to maintain his innocence even after realizing how suspicious his behavior appeared. But this argument was undermined by the elaborate nature of his media campaign and the obvious pleasure he had taken in the attention. On January 15, 2001, Lindsay Quai was found guilty of murdering his wife and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke of the particularly heinous nature of the crime. Not just the murder itself, but the calculated cruelty of the 18-month deception that followed. Elliot Quai, who had cooperated with police and testified against his brother, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for his role in disposing of the body. The court recognized that while his actions were inexcusable, he had been manipulated by his older brother and had ultimately done the right thing by confessing. The sentencing brought some measure of closure to Lindsay's family and friends, but it also raised disturbing questions about how easily the public and media had been manipulated. Mitchell's performance had been so convincing that he had transformed himself from the prime suspect in a murder case into a sympathetic figure fighting against police incompetence. The case highlighted the dangers of trial by media and the way that skilled manipulators can use publicity to advance their own agendas. It also demonstrated the importance of thorough police investigation, even in the face of public pressure to pursue other avenues. But perhaps most importantly, the case of Lindsay Quai served as a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal, most sympathetic, most deserving of our trust and compassion. In the years following Mitchell's conviction, the case continued to resonate with both law enforcement professionals and the general public. It became a textbook example of how psychopaths can manipulate media and public opinion to serve their own purposes. It influenced how police approached similar cases involving missing persons and suspects who seemed too eager to cooperate. The documentary footage that Mitchell had so willingly provided became a valuable resource for training law enforcement officers to recognize the signs of deceptive behavior. Psychological experts used his case to illustrate how certain personality disorders can enable individuals to lie convincingly even under intense scrutiny. For Lindsay's family, the years after the trial brought a different kind of pain. They had to come to terms not only with her death, but with the fact that they had been manipulated and deceived for 18 months by the person responsible for taking her life. The knowledge that they had felt sympathy for Mitchell, that they had supported his search efforts, added another layer of trauma to their grief. The children, who had been young when their mother disappeared, faced the difficult task of growing up with the knowledge that their father had murdered their mother and then lied about it for over a year. The psychological impact of this revelation would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The Lindsay Quai case offers a disturbing window into the mind of a particular type of killer, one who not only commits murder but finds ways to extract additional satisfaction from the crime's aftermath. Psychologists who studied the case identified several key characteristics that made Mitchell particularly dangerous. His narcissistic personality disorder gave him an inflated sense of self-importance and a belief that he was superior to those around him. This manifested in his apparent conviction that he could outsmart the police and manipulate the public indefinitely. He genuinely seemed to believe that his performance was so skilled that no one would ever see through it. His lack of empathy allowed him to watch Lindsay's family and friends suffer while knowing that their hope was false. A person with normal emotional responses would find it unbearable to maintain such a deception in the face of others' pain, but Mitchell appeared to find their anguish amusing rather than distressing. Perhaps most chillingly, Mitchell seemed to view the entire situation as a game, a test of his abilities against those of the police and the media. He took pride in each successful television appearance, each sympathetic news article, each moment when his performance convinced someone of his innocence. This game-like approach to serious crime is a hallmark of certain types of psychopaths. They view other people not as individuals deserving of respect and compassion, but as pieces to be moved around a board for their own entertainment and advantage. The Lindsay Quai case also raised important questions about the role of media in criminal investigations. Mitchell's successful manipulation of television programs and newspapers demonstrated how easily public opinion could be swayed by a skilled performer with a compelling story. Several media outlets that had featured Mitchell sympathetically were later criticized for failing to maintain appropriate skepticism about his claims. The desire for dramatic human interest stories had overridden journalistic caution, allowing Mitchell to use news platforms as vehicles for his deception. The case led to discussions within the media industry about how to cover ongoing criminal investigations more responsibly. It highlighted the need for journalists to maintain healthy skepticism even when dealing with apparently sympathetic figures, and to avoid becoming unwitting accomplices in manipulation campaigns. But the case also demonstrated the power of media when used appropriately. The documentary footage that Mitchell had authorized, thinking it would help his cause, ultimately provided crucial evidence of his guilt. His own words and behavior, captured on camera, became the strongest arguments against him at trial. The investigation and prosecution of Lindsay Quai provided valuable lessons for law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases. Police learned the importance of maintaining focus on evidence and investigation, even in the face of media pressure and public opinion. Detective Inspector Andy Brennan, who led the investigation, later spoke about how the case changed his approach to dealing with suspects who seemed too cooperative or too eager to help. He learned to view such behavior as potentially suspicious rather than simply helpful. The case also highlighted the value of psychological profiling in complex investigations. The behavioral analysts, who identified Mitchell's personality disorders, provided crucial insights that helped investigators understand his motivations and predict his behavior. For the legal system, the case demonstrated the challenges of prosecuting crimes without bodies, and the importance of building cases around multiple types of evidence rather than relying on any single piece of proof. In all the discussion of Lindsay Quai's manipulations and the failures of the investigation and media coverage, it's important to remember the real victim in this case: Lindsay Quai, a young mother who died at the hands of the person who should have protected her. Lindsay was described by those who knew her as a gentle, caring person who loved her children deeply. She had overcome a difficult childhood in care to build a life for herself and her family. Her friends remembered her quiet strength and her determination to create a better life for her children. The tragedy of Lindsay's death was compounded by the 18 months during which her memory was manipulated and exploited by her killer. Even in death, she became a pawn in Mitchell's elaborate game of deception and self-promotion. But in the end, the truth emerged. Justice was served, however delayed and imperfect it might have been, and Lindsay's story became a reminder of the importance of listening to women who speak of abuse, of taking domestic violence seriously, and of never allowing charm and manipulation to obscure the search for truth. As we close this story tonight, let us remember not the man who took Lindsay's life and then exploited her death for his own purposes, but the woman herself, a young mother whose life was cut short by violence, whose children grew up without her, and whose memory deserves better than the lies that surrounded her disappearance. The case of Lindsay Quai reminds us that evil can wear a familiar face, that the most dangerous people are often those who seem most normal, and that the search for truth requires persistence, courage, and the willingness to see past convincing performances to the reality beneath. In the quiet of this night, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps spare a thought for Lindsay, not as a victim of a sensational crime, but as a person who deserved better than the life and death she was given, and whose story serves as a reminder of the precious fragility of the lives we sometimes take for granted. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet suburb of Woronora, nestled in Sydney's southern reaches, the Gillum family seemed like any other middle-class Australian household. The tree-lined streets, with their modest brick homes and well-maintained gardens, offered the kind of peaceful existence that many families dream of. It was here, in this tranquil setting, that Stephen and Helen Gillum had built their lives, raising their two sons, Christopher and Jeffrey, in what appeared to be a loving, stable environment. Stephen Gillum, at 58, was a hard-working man who had spent years providing for his family. His wife Helen, 55, was known to neighbors as a warm, caring woman who took pride in her home and her children. Their eldest son, Christopher, 25, was described by those who knew him as a gentle soul, perhaps a bit quiet and introspective, but certainly not someone who would ever be associated with violence. Then there was Jeffrey, 23, the younger brother, who would become the central figure in one of Australia's most perplexing criminal cases. The morning of August 28, 1993 began like any other in the peaceful suburb. The sun was just beginning to cast its early light across the residential streets, when the tranquility was shattered by desperate pounding on a neighbor's door. It was still dark, that peculiar time of morning when the world feels suspended between night and day, when rational thought seems somehow more elusive. Jeffrey Gillum stood on his neighbor's doorstep, his appearance disheveled, his voice urgent and filled with what seemed like genuine terror. The story he told was so shocking, so utterly incomprehensible, that it would take years for the truth to fully emerge. According to Jeffrey, his older brother, Christopher, had just committed the unthinkable. He claimed that Christopher had brutally murdered their parents, Stephen and Helen, in their own home, and had even gone so far as to set their bodies ablaze. But the horror didn't end there. According to Jeffrey's account, in a moment of rage and disbelief upon discovering what his brother had done, Jeffrey claimed he had grabbed a knife and stabbed Christopher to death. 3 members of his family were dead, he said, and he was the only survivor of what appeared to be a night of unimaginable violence and tragedy. The neighbors, shocked and barely able to process what they were hearing, immediately contacted the police. Within minutes, emergency services were racing through the quiet streets of Woronora, their sirens cutting through the morning stillness like warnings of the devastation they would soon discover. When the first responders arrived at the Gillum family home, they found a scene that would haunt them for years to come. The house bore clear signs of a violent struggle, and the acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. Inside, they discovered the bodies of Stephen and Helen Gillum, both showing evidence of multiple stab wounds. Helen's body had indeed been set on fire, just as Jeffrey had claimed. Christopher's body was also found, fatally stabbed, completing the tragic tableau that Jeffrey had described to his neighbors. At first glance, Jeffrey's story seemed to align with the physical evidence. He appeared to be a traumatized young man who had witnessed his brother's descent into madness and had been forced to take desperate action to stop him. The police, while maintaining their professional skepticism, initially treated Jeffrey as a witness rather than a suspect. After all, he had willingly come forward with his account of events, and there was no immediately obvious reason to doubt his version of what had transpired. But as investigators began to delve deeper into the case, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. The forensic evidence, while initially seeming to support Jeffrey's story, began to tell a more complex tale upon closer examination. The patterns of blood spatter, the positioning of the bodies, and the nature of the wounds all suggested that the events of that night might not have unfolded exactly as Jeffrey had described. The investigation revealed that Stephen Gillum had suffered 29 stab wounds, a number that suggested an attack of extraordinary brutality and persistence. Helen had been stabbed 17 times, and Christopher had also received 17 wounds. These were not the quick, desperate strikes of a son defending himself against a homicidal brother, but rather the methodical, sustained assault of someone consumed by rage. Moreover, the forensic analysis of the fire that had consumed Helen's body raised additional questions. The burn patterns and the extent of the damage suggested that the fire had been deliberately set, which aligned with Jeffrey's story, but other aspects of the scene were more difficult to explain if Christopher had indeed been the perpetrator. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Jeffrey's story began to unravel under scrutiny. Friends and family members who were interviewed by police painted a picture of the Gillum household that was more complex than the harmonious family unit that had first been described. There were tensions within the family, financial pressures, and interpersonal conflicts that had previously been kept private. Neighbors recalled incidents that, in hindsight, seemed to take on new significance. There had been arguments heard from within the Gillum home, raised voices that carried through the walls on more than one occasion. These revelations didn't prove anything definitively, but they suggested that the family's life had not been quite as idyllic as it had initially appeared. Perhaps most troubling for Jeffrey's version of events was the forensic timeline that investigators were able to piece together. The evidence suggested that Christopher had been killed before the fire was set, which raised serious questions about Jeffrey's claim that he had killed his brother in a moment of rage, after discovering their parents' bodies burning. The case became even more complex when investigators discovered inconsistencies in Jeffrey's account of his own movements that night. Initially, he had provided what seemed like a straightforward timeline of events, but as detectives pressed him for more details, his story began to shift and change in subtle but significant ways. In 1995, Jeffrey Gillum was charged with the manslaughter of his brother Christopher. He pleaded guilty to this charge, maintaining his story that he had killed Christopher in a moment of passionate rage after discovering that Christopher had murdered their parents. The plea was consistent with his original account, and he was sentenced to a 5-year good behavior bond, a relatively lenient punishment that reflected the court's acceptance of his claim that he had acted under extreme provocation. For several years, it seemed as though the case had been resolved. Jeffrey had served no jail time for his brother's death, and the official record reflected his version of events. He was able to rebuild his life, eventually marrying and starting a family of his own. To many observers, it appeared that a young man who had survived an unthinkable family tragedy had been given a chance to move forward with his life. However, the case would not remain closed. In 2005, more than a decade after the murders, new evidence emerged that cast serious doubt on Jeffrey's account of what had happened that night in Warnora. Advanced forensic techniques that had not been available during the original investigation were now able to provide a clearer picture of the sequence of events. The new forensic analysis suggested that all 3 family members had been killed by the same person, and that the killer was almost certainly Jeffrey himself. The evidence indicated that he had systematically murdered his father, his mother, and his brother, and had then attempted to cover up his crimes by setting Helen's body on fire and concocting the story about Christopher's murderous rampage. In 2006, Jeffrey Gillum was arrested and charged with the murders of his parents, Stephen and Helen Gillum. The charges were based on the new forensic evidence, as well as a more thorough analysis of the inconsistencies in his original testimony. The case that had seemed closed was now wide open again, and Jeffrey found himself facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The trial that followed was a fascinating study in the evolution of forensic science and the complexities of criminal justice. The prosecution argued that Jeffrey had killed all 3 family members in a fit of rage, possibly triggered by family conflicts or financial pressures that had been building over time. They painted a picture of a young man who had snapped under pressure and had then demonstrated remarkable cunning in attempting to cover up his crimes. The defense, meanwhile, continued to maintain Jeffrey's innocence of his parents' murders, arguing that the new forensic evidence was open to interpretation, and that there was no clear motive for Jeffrey to kill his entire family. They suggested that the original version of events, while perhaps not perfect in every detail, remained the most plausible explanation for what had occurred. The trial was closely watched by the Australian media and the public, who were fascinated by the case's twists and turns. Here was a story that seemed to have everything: family secrets, forensic mysteries, questions of justice and injustice, and a defendant who had lived freely for more than a decade before being charged with crimes that could have sent him to prison for life. The evidence presented during the trial was both compelling and complex. Forensic experts testified about blood spatter patterns, wound trajectories, and the timing of the fire that had consumed Helen's body. The prosecution's case relied heavily on this scientific evidence, arguing that it clearly demonstrated Jeffrey's guilt in all three deaths. However, the defense was able to raise questions about some of the forensic findings, pointing out inconsistencies and alternative interpretations of the evidence. They also highlighted the fact that Jeffrey had voluntarily come forward with his story immediately after the murders, behavior that seemed inconsistent with someone who had just committed a triple homicide and was attempting to cover it up. In 2009, after a lengthy trial and extensive deliberation, Jeffrey Gillum was convicted of murdering his parents and sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. The conviction seemed to bring closure to a case that had haunted investigators and the community for more than 15 years. Justice, it appeared, had finally been served. But Jeffrey's legal battles were far from over. His defense team immediately filed an appeal, arguing that the conviction had been based on flawed forensic evidence, and that there were serious questions about the reliability of some of the scientific testimony that had been presented at trial. They maintained that Jeffrey was innocent of his parents' murders, and that the original version of events, while tragic, remained the truth. The appeals process would prove to be almost as complex and lengthy as the original investigation and trial. Legal experts pored over thousands of pages of testimony and evidence, looking for errors in the proceedings that might have led to a wrongful conviction. The case became a cause célèbre among those who believed that Jeffrey had been the victim of overzealous prosecution and unreliable forensic science. In 2012, in a stunning reversal, Jeffrey Gillum's convictions for his parents' murders were quashed by the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal. The court found that there had been errors in the original trial and that the forensic evidence was not as conclusive as it had initially appeared. Jeffrey was released from prison after serving 3 years of his life sentence. The decision to overturn Jeffrey's convictions was based on several factors. The appeals court found that some of the forensic evidence that had been central to the prosecution's case was unreliable or had been misinterpreted. There were also questions raised about the conduct of the original trial and whether Jeffrey had received adequate legal representation. However, the court's decision to quash the convictions did not necessarily mean that Jeffrey was innocent of the charges. Instead, it meant that the evidence presented at trial had not been sufficient to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution was given the option to retry Jeffrey on the murder charges, a decision that would require them to present their case again with the benefit of the appeals court's guidance. In the end, the prosecution chose not to proceed with a retrial. The case had already consumed enormous resources, both financial and human, and there were questions about whether a retrial would be likely to produce a different outcome. The decision meant that Jeffrey Gillum would not face further prosecution for his parents' deaths, effectively bringing his legal ordeal to an end. The resolution of the Gillum case, if it can be called that, left many questions unanswered. To this day, there is no definitive answer to what really happened in the Gillum family home on that August night in 1993. The official record now reflects Jeffrey's acquittal on the murder charges, but the broader question of guilt or innocence remains a matter of debate and speculation. Some observers believe that Jeffrey was indeed guilty of all 3 murders, and that he successfully manipulated the legal system to avoid punishment for his crimes. They point to the forensic evidence and the inconsistencies in his story as proof that he was responsible for the deaths of his entire family. From this perspective, Jeffrey's release from prison represents a failure of the justice system, and a tragedy for the victims who will never receive true justice. Others, however, believe that Jeffrey was the victim of a rush to judgment and unreliable forensic science. They argue that his original story, while perhaps imperfect in some details, remains the most plausible explanation for what occurred. From this perspective, Jeffrey's conviction and imprisonment represented a grave miscarriage of justice, and his eventual release was a vindication of the appeals process and the importance of maintaining high standards of evidence in criminal prosecutions. The truth about what happened to the Gillum family may never be definitively known. The physical evidence, while extensive, is open to interpretation, and the only living witness to the events of that night is Jeffrey himself. His account of what transpired has remained consistent over the years, despite the legal challenges he has faced. But questions about its accuracy continue to linger. What is certain is that the case represents one of the most complex and controversial criminal prosecutions in recent Australian legal history. It highlights the challenges inherent in forensic science, the importance of maintaining high standards of evidence in criminal trials, and the devastating impact that violent crime can have on families and communities. The Gillum case also raises broader questions about the nature of truth and justice in the criminal legal system. In an ideal world, criminal trials would always produce clear, unambiguous answers about guilt and innocence. In reality, however, many cases involve complex evidence, competing interpretations, and unanswered questions that may never be fully resolved. For Jeffrey Gillum, the resolution of his legal battles allowed him to return to his family and attempt to rebuild his life. He had spent years fighting to clear his name, and his ultimate acquittal represented a vindication of his claims of innocence. However, the shadow of the allegations against him would likely remain with him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the tragic events that had torn his family apart. The residents of Warnora, meanwhile, were left to grapple with the realization that their quiet suburb had been the site of one of Australia's most notorious family murders. The house where the Gillum family had lived and died became a somber landmark, a reminder of the violence that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most peaceful communities. For the investigators and legal professionals who worked on the case, the Gillum murders represented both a professional challenge and a personal ordeal. They had spent years attempting to uncover the truth about what had happened, only to see their conclusions challenged and ultimately overturned by the appeals process. The case would serve as a reminder of the limitations of forensic science and the importance of maintaining skepticism and rigor in criminal investigations. The media coverage of the Gillum case also raised questions about the role of public opinion in high-profile criminal prosecutions. The case had been closely followed by the Australian press and public, and the intense scrutiny may have influenced the conduct of both the prosecution and the defense. The case became as much a public spectacle as a legal proceeding, with Jeffrey's guilt or innocence debated in newspapers, on television, and in online forums. As the years have passed since Jeffrey's acquittal, the Gillum case has taken on a different significance. It has become a case study for legal scholars, forensic scientists, and criminologists who are interested in understanding the complexities of criminal justice and the challenges of determining truth in cases involving violent crime. The case has also become a touchstone for discussions about the reliability of forensic evidence and the importance of maintaining high standards in criminal prosecutions. The initial conviction and subsequent acquittal of Jeffrey Gillum demonstrate both the power and the limitations of scientific evidence in criminal trials. For families who have been affected by violent crime, the Gillum case serves as a reminder of the long and often frustrating process of seeking justice. The case dragged on for nearly 2 decades, leaving victims' families in limbo and preventing closure for those who had been touched by the tragedy. The extended family members of Stephen, Helen, and Christopher Gillum were left to watch as the case against Jeffrey proceeded through multiple trials and appeals. Some family members believed in Jeffrey's guilt and were devastated by his eventual acquittal, while others supported him throughout his legal ordeal. The case divided the family and created lasting rifts that may never fully heal. The psychological impact of the Gillum case on all those involved cannot be understated. Jeffrey himself spent years living under the cloud of suspicion and accusation, fighting to clear his name while simultaneously grieving the loss of his entire immediate family. The stress of the legal proceedings, combined with the trauma of the original tragedy, would have been overwhelming for anyone. The case also had a profound impact on the legal professionals who worked on it. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and forensic experts all found themselves grappling with questions that had no easy answers. The case challenged their assumptions about evidence, truth, and justice, and forced them to confront the limitations of their respective fields. As we look back on the Gillum family murders, more than 30 years after they occurred, we are reminded of the fragility of human life and the devastating impact that violence can have on individuals, families, and communities. The case serves as a stark reminder that tragedy can strike anywhere, at any time, and that the pursuit of justice is often more complex and challenging than we might expect. The legacy of the Gillum case extends far beyond the specific facts of what happened in Warnora on that August night in 1993. It represents a cautionary tale about the limitations of forensic science, the importance of maintaining high standards in criminal prosecutions, and the enduring mystery of human behavior. Whether Jeffrey Gillum was a victim of circumstances who defended himself against a murderous brother, or a calculating killer who successfully manipulated the legal system to avoid punishment for his crimes, may never be definitively known. What is certain is that the case will continue to fascinate and puzzle observers for years to come, serving as a reminder of the complex and often ambiguous nature of criminal justice. The quiet streets of Woronora have returned to their peaceful routine in the decades since the Gillum family murders. New families have moved into the neighborhood. Children play in the same streets where the tragedy once unfolded. And life has continued on as it always does. But for those who remember the case, the memory of that August night in 1993 remains vivid. A reminder of the darkness that can sometimes intrude upon the most ordinary of lives. The story of the Gillum family murders stands as one of Australia's most perplexing criminal cases. A puzzle that may never be fully solved. It reminds us that truth is often more elusive than we might hope, and that justice, while always worth pursuing, is not always achievable in the clear, definitive manner that we might desire. In the end, the case leaves us with more questions than answers, and perhaps that is the most honest conclusion we can reach about this tragic and complex chapter in criminal history. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet suburban community of Delmar, New York, nestled in the shadows of Albany's rolling hills, the Porco family had built what seemed like an idyllic life. Peter Porco, a distinguished 52-year-old law clerk for the New York State Appellate Division, had worked his way up through the legal system with dedication and integrity. His wife Joan, a children's speech pathologist, devoted her career to helping young minds find their voice. Together they had raised 2 sons in their comfortable home on Broccoli Drive, a tree-lined street where neighbors knew each other's names and children played freely in well-manicured yards. But beneath this veneer of suburban tranquility, a darkness was brewing that would shatter not only the Porco family, but an entire community's sense of security. The story begins not on the night of November 14, 2004, but years earlier, in the seemingly ordinary tensions that exist in many American families. Christopher Porco, the younger of the 2 Porco sons, had always been the more challenging child. While his older brother Jonathan excelled academically and professionally, Christopher struggled to find his footing. He was intelligent, certainly charming even, but there was something different about him, something that his parents couldn't quite put their finger on. Christopher had enrolled at the University of Rochester, pursuing his studies while living on campus. To his parents, this represented hope, a chance for their son to mature, to find direction, to become the man they knew he could be. They supported him financially, as loving parents do, sending money for tuition, room and board, and living expenses. What they didn't know was that their son was living a double life, one built on an increasingly complex web of lies and deception. The first signs of trouble came in the form of unpaid bills and mysterious charges. Peter and Joan began receiving calls from creditors, notices about overdue payments on accounts they didn't even know existed. When they confronted Christopher, he had explanations, mix-ups with the billing department, clerical errors, problems with his student account. His parents, wanting to believe their son, accepted these explanations and helped cover the shortfalls. But the problems persisted and grew worse. Credit card bills arrived at the family home showing charges that Christopher had never mentioned. When pressed, he claimed his identity had been stolen, that someone else was using his information to make purchases. Again, his parents chose to believe him, even as doubt began to creep into their minds. They were busy with their own careers and lives, and it was easier to accept their son's explanations than to dig deeper into what was becoming an increasingly troubling pattern. The deception ran deeper than simple overspending. Christopher had forged documents, created fake letterheads, and even gone so far as to impersonate college officials and phone calls to his parents. When questions arose about his academic performance or attendance, he would produce fabricated transcripts showing excellent grades. When his parents called the university to verify information, Christopher would arrange to have his friends answer the phone, pretending to be administrators confirming his lies. By the fall of 2004, the charade was becoming impossible to maintain. Peter Porco, with his legal background and natural attention to detail, was growing increasingly suspicious. Phone calls were made to the university that Christopher couldn't intercept. Records were requested that couldn't be forged. The truth was slowly emerging. Christopher had been failing classes, skipping substantial amounts of coursework, and was in danger of being expelled. Worse still, the debt he had accumulated through credit cards, forged checks, and fraudulent loans was approaching $50,000. The confrontation, when it finally came, was devastating. Peter and Joan learned not just about the money, but about the extent of their son's deception. The fake grades, the impersonated phone calls, the systematic lies that had been fed to them for months. For parents who had given their son every opportunity, every benefit of the doubt, the betrayal cut deeply. Peter in particular was furious. As a man who had built his career on integrity and honesty, his son's behavior was not just disappointing, it was incomprehensible. In the days leading up to November 14th, tensions in the Porco household reached a breaking point. There were heated arguments, threats of legal action, and ultimatums about Christopher's future. Peter had discovered that his son had been forging his signature on various documents, including loan applications. The threat of criminal charges hung in the air. Joan, caught between her husband's anger and her maternal instincts, struggled to find a way to bridge the growing chasm in her family. Christopher, faced with the collapse of his carefully constructed lies, found himself in an impossible position. The debt was overwhelming. His academic career was in ruins, and his relationship with his parents was perhaps irreparably damaged. But rather than face the consequences of his actions, rather than work toward redemption and reconciliation, Christopher's mind turned to a solution that would forever mark him as something far more dangerous than a troubled young man making poor choices. November 14th, 2004, was a Sunday. Christopher was supposed to be at the University of Rochester, 3 hours away from the family home. His parents believed he was there, focused on his studies, perhaps beginning to turn his life around. They had no reason to think otherwise. The surveillance cameras at his dormitory would later show him leaving his room that evening. But this wasn't unusual. College students come and go at all hours, and Christopher's departure wouldn't have seemed noteworthy to anyone who might have observed it. What happened next would be reconstructed through painstaking police work, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. But the full truth of that night remained known only to Christopher himself. What is certain is that sometime after midnight, in the early hours of November 15th, a figure moved through the darkness toward the Porco family home on Broccoli Drive. The house itself was a modest but comfortable two-story colonial, set back from the road and partially shielded by mature trees. The Porcos were not wealthy by any means, but Peter's steady income and Joan's salary had provided them with a solid middle-class lifestyle. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people felt safe leaving doors unlocked and windows open on pleasant evenings. Inside the house, Peter and Joan were sleeping peacefully in their bedroom. They had no reason to fear for their safety, no indication that danger was approaching. The house's security system was sophisticated for its time, but it would prove to be no barrier to someone who knew the code, someone who had lived in the house and understood its rhythms and vulnerabilities. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. The weapon was an axe, chosen for its efficiency and the devastating damage it could inflict. Peter Porco was struck multiple times in the head as he slept, the blows so severe that his death would have been nearly instantaneous. Joan, lying beside her husband, was also attacked, suffering grievous injuries to her face and head that left her unconscious and bleeding profusely. The scene that greeted investigators hours later was one of unimaginable horror. Blood covered the bedroom walls, the ceiling, the bedding, and the floor. The violence had been intense and personal, suggesting not the work of a stranger seeking quick profit, but someone driven by deep anger or desperation. Yet, curiously, the house showed signs of having been staged to look like a burglary. Drawers were pulled open, items were scattered about, and valuable electronics were conspicuously left untouched. Details that experienced investigators found immediately suspicious. Peter Porco's injuries were so severe that it was remarkable he had lived even briefly after the attack, and medical examiners would later determine that despite the devastating trauma to his head, he had somehow managed to get out of bed, walk downstairs, and attempt to go about his morning routine. The human body's ability to function even after catastrophic injury is one of medicine's most puzzling phenomena, and Peter's actions that morning would become central to the investigation that followed. Joan Porco's survival was nothing short of miraculous. The injuries to her face and skull were life-threatening, causing significant brain damage and requiring months of intensive medical care and rehabilitation. When she finally regained consciousness weeks later, she had no memory of the attack and would struggle with cognitive and physical challenges for the rest of her life. The woman who had once helped children overcome speech difficulties now faced the daunting task of relearning basic communication skills herself. The investigation began immediately, with the Bethlehem Police Department working alongside state investigators to process the crime scene and interview potential witnesses. The brutality of the attack and the apparent staging of a burglary suggested that this was not a random crime. The investigators' attention quickly turned to the family members, particularly the sons who stood to inherit the couple's estate and life insurance benefits. Jonathan Porco, the older son, was quickly ruled out as a suspect. He had a solid alibi, having been at work in New York City with multiple witnesses who could account for his whereabouts throughout the night of the attack. His relationship with his parents was strong, and there were no financial or personal motives that would suggest his involvement. Christopher, however, presented a very different picture. His financial troubles, his history of deception, and his strained relationship with his parents made him an immediate person of interest. When investigators attempted to contact him at the University of Rochester, they discovered that he had left campus the previous evening and had not returned. His whereabouts during the critical hours of the attack were unaccounted for, and his behavior in the days following the crime struck investigators as unusual and suspicious. The first major break in the case came from an unexpected source: surveillance footage from Christopher's dormitory. The cameras showed him leaving his room around 10 p.m. on November 14th. But more importantly, they captured him returning in the early morning hours of November 15th. The timing was significant. If Christopher had been involved in the attack, this footage provided a window of opportunity that aligned with the estimated time of the crime. But surveillance footage alone was not enough to build a case. Investigators needed to trace Christopher's movements more precisely, to establish not just that he had left campus, but where he had gone. This is where one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case emerged: toll booth records from the New York State Thruway. The drive from the University of Rochester to Delmar requires travel on the Thruway, a major highway with multiple toll booths that record the passage of vehicles. In 2004, these tolls were still collected manually by human operators, and many of the transactions involved paper tickets that drivers would receive when entering the highway and return when exiting. Investigators obtained records from the relevant toll booths and made a discovery that would prove central to the prosecution's case. On the night of November 14th and early morning of November 15th, toll operators at two different locations remembered seeing a distinctive yellow Jeep Wrangler driven by a young white male. This was significant because Christopher Porco drove a yellow Jeep Wrangler, a vehicle that was well known to his family and friends. John Fallon, a toll collector working the Rochester entry point, specifically remembered the yellow Jeep because he had thought it would be a nice car for his own son to have. The detail was mundane but memorable, the kind of fleeting observation that can become crucial evidence in a criminal investigation. Fallon testified that he had handed a toll ticket to the driver, a young man who fit Christopher's description. More dramatically, investigators found that one of these toll tickets, recovered from the Albany toll booth, contained DNA evidence. Forensic analysis revealed mitochondrial DNA that was consistent with Christopher Porco's genetic profile. While not as definitive as nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA can still provide strong evidence of identity, particularly when combined with other circumstantial evidence. The DNA evidence was particularly compelling because of the circumstances under which it was found. The toll ticket had been collected and processed in the normal course of business, with no knowledge that it might become evidence in a murder investigation. This ruled out any possibility of tampering or planted evidence, lending credibility to the forensic findings. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected witness: Marshall Goki, a neighbor who lived across the street from the Porco family. Goki was an insomniac who often found himself awake during the early morning hours. And on November 15th, he was looking out his window when he saw something that initially seemed unremarkable but would later take on sinister significance. At approximately 3:45 a.m., Goki observed a yellow Jeep Wrangler parked in the Porco family's driveway. The vehicle looked exactly like Christopher's Jeep, down to specific details and modifications that made it distinctive. Goki thought it was odd that Christopher would be visiting his parents so late, but it didn't seem alarming enough to warrant immediate attention. Only later, after the attack was discovered, did Goki realize the significance of what he had witnessed. The timeline that emerged from this evidence was compelling. Christopher had left his dormitory on Sunday evening, driven the 3 hours from Rochester to Delmar, arrived at his parents' home around 3:45 a.m., committed the attack, and then driven back to Rochester, arriving in time to be captured on surveillance footage. Returning to his dormitory, the round trip would have taken approximately 6 hours, which aligned perfectly with his absence from campus. Yet despite this seemingly overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the case against Christopher Porco was not without its challenges. Defense attorneys pointed out that there was virtually no physical evidence directly linking him to the crime scene. No fingerprints on the axe, no blood evidence on his clothes or in his vehicle, no witnesses who saw him actually entering or leaving the house. The prosecution theorized that Christopher had worn protective clothing, possibly scrubs from a veterinary clinic where he worked part-time, and had disposed of them after the attack. This theory gained some support from testimony that scrubs were missing from the veterinary clinic, but it remained speculative. The defense argued that the absence of physical evidence was not consistent with such a violent crime, where blood spatter and other forensic traces would be nearly impossible to avoid completely. The defense also challenged the reliability of the eyewitness testimony. Marshal Goki had observed the yellow Jeep from across the street in the early morning darkness. While he was certain about what he had seen, the defense raised questions about the accuracy of his identification and the possibility that he might have seen a different vehicle entirely. Similarly, the toll booth operator's testimony, while compelling, was based on memories of a brief interaction months earlier. The defense argued that the operators might be mistaken about the specific vehicle or might be unconsciously influenced by media coverage of the case to remember details that supported the prosecution's theory. The DNA evidence, while significant, was also not without limitations. Mitochondrial DNA is less specific than nuclear DNA and can be shared by maternal relatives. The defense argued that the DNA evidence, while consistent with Christopher being the source, could not definitively prove that he had handled the toll ticket in question. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the case for the prosecution was the absence of a clear motive. While Christopher's financial problems and deception provided context, they hardly seemed sufficient to justify such an extreme act of violence. Many young people accumulate debt and lie to their parents without resorting to murder. The prosecution argued that Christopher was facing not just financial ruin, but potential criminal charges for forgery and fraud, making the situation more desperate than typical college-age financial irresponsibility. The theory presented by prosecutors was that Christopher saw his parents' death as a solution to his problems. Peter and Joan had life insurance policies totaling approximately $1 million, with their sons as beneficiaries. If both parents died, Christopher would inherit not only this money, but also the family home and other assets. In his mind, the prosecution argued, this represented a way out of his financial difficulties and legal troubles. The case went to trial in 2006. The proceedings moved to Orange County due to extensive pre-trial publicity in Albany County. The trial drew significant media attention, partly because of the shocking nature of the crime, and partly because of the seemingly unlikely defendant. Christopher Porco appeared young and clean-cut, more like a typical college student than someone capable of such brutal violence. Joan Porco's testimony became one of the most dramatic and controversial aspects of the trial. Still recovering from her injuries and struggling with memory loss and cognitive difficulties, she appeared as a witness for the defense. In emotional testimony, she stated that she did not believe her son could have committed such a crime. Her loyalty to Christopher, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, struck many observers as both heartbreaking and frustrating. The prosecution argued that Joan's memory loss and brain damage made her testimony unreliable, while the defense contended that a mother's intuition about her own child carried special weight. The jury was left to wrestle with the difficult question of how much credence to give to the testimony of someone who had suffered such severe trauma and whose cognitive abilities had been significantly impaired. Throughout the trial, Christopher maintained his innocence, presenting himself as a loving son who could never harm his parents. His defense team argued that he was being scapegoated for a crime committed by an unknown intruder, and that the evidence against him was purely circumstantial and unreliable. The prosecution painted a different picture, a young man so desperate to escape the consequences of his own poor choices that he was willing to commit the ultimate betrayal. They argued that Christopher had carefully planned the attack, knowing his parents' routines and the layout of their home, and had attempted to stage the scene to throw suspicion away from himself. After days of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Christopher Porco was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of his father and attempted murder in the attack on his mother. The conviction carried with it a sentence of 50 years to life in prison, effectively ensuring that Christopher would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The verdict brought closure to some aspects of the case, but many questions remained unanswered. How could a young man with no history of serious violence commit such a brutal act? What was going through his mind as he drove through the darkness toward his family home? Did he truly believe that killing his parents would solve his problems, or was this the desperate act of someone who had lost all perspective on reality? The case also raised troubling questions about family dynamics and the pressures facing young people in modern society. How many other families were dealing with similar issues of deception, financial irresponsibility, and strained relationships? What warning signs had been missed, and could this tragedy have been prevented? For the community of Delmar, the Porco case shattered assumptions about safety and family bonds. The idea that such violence could occur in their quiet neighborhood, committed by someone who seemed so ordinary, forced residents to confront uncomfortable truths about the potential for darkness that exists within seemingly normal families. Joan Porco's recovery became an ongoing struggle that extended far beyond the trial. The woman who had once been articulate and professionally accomplished now faced daily challenges with basic tasks. Her speech, which she had helped so many children develop, became halting and difficult. The cognitive damage from her injuries affected her memory, her reasoning abilities, and her capacity to understand complex concepts. Yet Joan's spirit remained unbroken. With the support of her surviving son Jonathan and a network of friends and colleagues, she worked tirelessly to rebuild her life. Her continued insistence on Christopher's innocence remained a source of controversy, with some seeing it as admirable maternal loyalty and others viewing it as denial of overwhelming evidence. The case continued to attract attention long after the trial ended. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail, searching for alternative explanations or missed clues. Some suggested that the investigation had been rushed, that other suspects had not been adequately considered, or that the evidence against Christopher was not as solid as it appeared. Christopher himself has never admitted guilt, and continues to maintain his innocence from prison. He has filed multiple appeals, challenging various aspects of his conviction and sentence. His legal team has raised questions about the effectiveness of his original defense counsel, the reliability of the DNA evidence, and the fairness of his trial. These appeals have been consistently denied by higher courts, but they reflect the complex legal and factual issues that continue to surround the case. The conviction stands, but the debate over Christopher Porco's guilt or innocence continues in some circles, fueled by the absence of direct physical evidence and the reliance on circumstantial proof. The murder weapon, the axe used in the attack, was never definitively identified or recovered in a way that provided additional evidence. This remains one of the case's lingering mysteries and a focus of those who question Christopher's conviction. Where did the weapon come from? How was it disposed of? Why was no trace evidence found that could link it directly to the defendant? The investigation into these questions revealed the meticulous planning that prosecutors argued had gone into the crime. If Christopher was indeed the perpetrator, he had thought carefully about how to commit the attack while minimizing the physical evidence that could link him to the scene. The theory that he wore protective clothing and carefully disposed of both the weapon and any contaminated materials suggested a level of premeditation that made the crime even more chilling. For the investigators who worked the case, the Porco murder represented both a success and a source of ongoing frustration. They had built a strong enough case to secure a conviction, but the absence of definitive physical evidence meant that questions would always remain. The case highlighted both the power and the limitations of circumstantial evidence in complex criminal investigations. The forensic aspects of the case also provided lessons for future investigations. The DNA analysis of the toll ticket represented cutting-edge forensic science for its time, demonstrating how seemingly insignificant pieces of evidence could prove crucial to solving crimes. The techniques used in the Porco investigation would later be applied to other cases, helping to advance the field of forensic science. The psychological dimensions of the case continue to fascinate experts in criminal behavior. What drives someone to commit such an act of violence against their own family members? The financial pressures and legal troubles that Christopher faced, while serious, seemed insufficient to explain such extreme behavior. Some experts suggested that deeper psychological issues might have been at play. Personality disorders, antisocial tendencies, or other mental health factors that had gone undiagnosed. The case also highlighted the phenomenon of family annihilation, where individuals kill multiple family members, often including themselves. While Christopher's case didn't follow the typical pattern, he survived and attempted to establish an alibi. It shared some characteristics with other instances of domestic violence that escalate to murder. The intimate knowledge of the victims, the personal nature of the attack, and the attempt to stage the scene as something other than what it was all fit recognized patterns in such crimes. For Joan Porco, The years following the trial brought a slow and difficult journey toward a new version of normal. Her physical recovery was remarkable by medical standards, but the cognitive and emotional challenges remained significant. She had to relearn basic tasks, rebuild relationships, and come to terms with a world that had been forever changed by that November night. The question of whether Joan truly believed in Christopher's innocence or whether her brain injuries affected her ability to process the evidence remained a subject of speculation and debate. Family members and friends were divided in their interpretation of her statements, with some seeing genuine conviction and others suspecting that trauma and cognitive damage had affected her judgment. The surviving son, Jonathan, faced his own challenges in dealing with the aftermath of the crime. Having lost his father and seen his mother permanently disabled, while watching his brother convicted of these horrific acts, Jonathan had to rebuild his life while carrying an enormous emotional burden. His relationship with Christopher was understandably strained, and he faced the difficult task of supporting his mother while accepting the reality of what had happened to their family. The broader community also struggled to move forward from the shock of the Porco case. Neighbors on Broccoli Drive installed security systems and deadbolt locks, tangible reminders that their sense of safety had been permanently altered. The case became a reference point for discussions about family violence, mental health, and the hidden pressures facing young people in contemporary society. Local schools and community organizations used the Porco case as a starting point for conversations about warning signs of family dysfunction and the importance of seeking help when financial or academic pressures become overwhelming. The tragedy served as a reminder that beneath the surface of seemingly successful families, serious problems might be festering. As the years passed, the Porco case settled into its place in the annals of true crime history. It became the subject of television documentaries, podcast episodes, and countless online discussions. Each retelling brought new perspectives and interpretations, but the essential facts remained unchanged. On November 15, 2004, Peter Porco was murdered, and Joan Porco was nearly killed in a brutal attack that destroyed a family and shocked a community. The case stands as a stark reminder of how quickly lives can be shattered by violence, how families can harbor secrets and tensions that outsiders never see, and how the consequences of poor choices can escalate in ways that seem unimaginable until they become reality. It also demonstrates the complexity of the criminal justice system, where circumstantial evidence and expert testimony must be weighed against reasonable doubt and the presumption of innocence. Christopher Porco remains in prison today, having exhausted most of his legal appeals. He continues to maintain his innocence, and a small group of supporters still argues for his exoneration. Whether he will ever admit to the crimes or provide a complete account of what happened that night remains unknown. Joan Porco continues her recovery, supported by family and friends who have never given up hope for her continued improvement. Her journey represents both the resilience of the human spirit and the lasting impact of violent crime on innocent victims. She has become, in many ways, a symbol of survival against impossible odds. The house on Broccoli Drive eventually sold to new owners who were willing to look past its dark history. The neighborhood has moved on, as neighborhoods do, but the memory of what happened there lingers. For those who lived through the investigation and trial, the Porco case remains a defining moment that changed how they view their community and their assumptions about family life. In the end, the murder of Peter Porco and the attempted murder of Joan Porco represents more than just another true crime story. It's a tragic reminder of how financial pressure, deception, and family conflict can spiral out of control with devastating consequences. It's a case study in the power of circumstantial evidence and the challenges of prosecuting crimes without direct physical proof. And it's a human story of love, betrayal, survival, and the endless capacity for both good and evil that exists within ordinary families. The questions raised by the Porco case extend far beyond the specifics of this particular crime. How do we recognize and address the warning signs of family dysfunction before they escalate to violence? What support systems should be available for young people struggling with financial and academic pressures? How do we balance skepticism and trust when dealing with those we love? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions worth asking as we try to understand not just what happened on Broccoli Drive that November night, but how we might prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Porco case serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action, reminding us that behind every crime statistic is a human story of lives forever changed by violence. As this story comes to its close, we're left with the sobering reality that some questions may never be fully answered. The complete truth of what happened in those early morning hours remains known only to Christopher Porco himself. Whether driven by desperation, mental illness, greed, or some combination of factors we may never fully understand, the events of that night created ripples that continue to affect lives today. The case reminds us that truth in criminal justice is often complex and multifaceted, that evidence must be carefully weighed and interpreted, and that the consequences of our actions can extend far beyond anything we might imagine. In the quiet suburbs of Delmar, New York, the Porco family learned these lessons in the most tragic way possible, and their story continues to serve as a reminder of both the fragility of life and the importance of family bonds built on honesty, communication, and love. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. The glass shattered with a sound that would echo through the courtrooms of Tulsa, Oklahoma for years to come. On the evening of June 7, 2011, 25 floors above the bustling downtown streets, a marriage would end in the most tragic way imaginable. Joshua Hillberling was 23 years old, a former football player whose athletic build had earned him respect on the field and beyond. Standing tall with broad shoulders and an easy smile, Josh seemed to have everything going for him. He had recently served in the United States Air Force, though his military career had been cut short under circumstances that would later become central to understanding the volatile relationship that would ultimately claim his life. Amber Lynn Hillberling was just 19, a young woman with striking features and a complicated past. The couple had been married for barely a year, but their relationship was already showing signs of the destructive patterns that would define their brief time together. What began as a whirlwind romance had quickly devolved into something far more dangerous. The University Club Tower stood as one of Tulsa's most prestigious residential buildings, its sleek glass facade reflecting the Oklahoma sky from 25 stories above Carson Avenue. For Josh and Amber, apartment 2516 was supposed to represent a new beginning. Instead, it became the stage for a tragedy that would divide public opinion and raise questions about domestic violence, self-defense, and the thin line between accident and murder. To understand what happened on that June evening, we must first examine the relationship that brought these two young people to that moment. Josh's military service had been troubled. According to his Air Force records, there had been incidents involving domestic disputes. Josh Hillberling's U.S. Air Force file details an incident in which he threw a plate at Amber and attempted to snap one of her breast implants. These records would later reveal a pattern of behavior that painted Josh not as the victim, but as an aggressor in their troubled marriage. Amber told Dr. Phil that Josh was released from the military in part because of drug-related issues. The young couple's problems were multifaceted: financial stress, substance abuse, and what would emerge as a cycle of violence that seemed to escalate with each passing month. But Amber's story was equally complicated. She wasn't simply an innocent victim caught in an abusive relationship. As the case would later reveal, she had her own history of troubling behavior. The prosecution would argue that she was manipulative, calculating, and capable of extreme violence when pushed to her limits. The apartment itself played a crucial role in the events that unfolded. The 25th floor offered breathtaking views of Tulsa, but it also presented unique dangers. The floor-to-ceiling windows were designed to maximize the panoramic vistas, but they were constructed with tempered glass that, while meeting building codes, would become a subject of intense scrutiny during the trial. Window expert testimony would later reveal that the glass used in high-rise buildings like the University Club Tower was designed to withstand normal impacts, but had limitations that most residents never considered. The windows were not meant to stop a human body traveling at high speed, especially when that impact came from an unexpected angle or with unusual force. On the morning of June 7th, neighbors in the building had already heard raised voices coming from apartment 2516. The Hillberlings' arguments had become a regular occurrence, with other residents occasionally hearing shouting, crashing sounds, and what appeared to be physical altercations. But this day felt different. There was an intensity to their conflict that seemed to escalate beyond their usual disputes. According to Amber's later testimony, the argument began over something seemingly trivial: money. As it often did, Josh had been struggling to find stable employment since his military discharge. and the financial pressure was mounting. Amber was working, but their lifestyle in the expensive downtown apartment was stretching their resources thin. The stress was taking its toll on both of them, but particularly on Josh, who felt emasculated by his inability to provide for his young wife. As the day progressed, the argument intensified. Witnesses would later testify that they heard shouting coming from the apartment throughout the afternoon. Josh had filed a protective order against his wife, suggesting that the violence in their relationship wasn't entirely one-sided. This protective order would become a crucial piece of evidence, challenging the narrative that Josh was purely the aggressor in their relationship. The events of the evening began to unfold around dinner time. According to Amber's account, Josh had been drinking, which often made his behavior more unpredictable and aggressive. She claimed that he became increasingly agitated, eventually becoming physically threatening. The apartment's layout, with its open floor plan and those floor-to-ceiling windows, meant that any physical confrontation would inevitably bring them close to the very glass that would ultimately prove so deadly. Amber would later testify that Josh grabbed her, pushing her against the window. She described feeling the glass pressing against her back, cold and unforgiving. In that moment, she claimed, she feared for her life. The window, she said, felt fragile beneath the pressure of their struggling bodies. It was then, according to her testimony, that she made the split-second decision that would change everything. She pushed back. What happened next would become the subject of intense debate and expert analysis. Two witnesses testified that they saw Joshua Hillberling come out the window face first and upright. That contradicted other statements. The positioning of Josh's body as he fell would become crucial to understanding whether Amber's actions were defensive or aggressive. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the evening air, followed immediately by what witnesses described as a sickening thud. Josh fell from the 25th floor of the building, his body ultimately coming to rest on the 8th floor parking garage roof below. The impact was devastating and immediately fatal. The medical examiner said Josh Hillberling had broken bones in both his arms and both his legs. Most of his ribs were broken, along with his sternum and pelvis and neck. He also had numerous internal injuries. The extent of his injuries left no doubt about the force of the impact and the impossibility of survival. But what happened immediately after Josh's fall would prove just as important to the case as the fall itself. Amber quickly went down the elevator into her husband's broken body. At only 23 years old, Josh Hillberling was dead. Despite his obvious traumatic injuries, Amber screamed for someone to help him. She kissed his face, continuing to shout for someone to help her husband. This behavior would become a point of contention during the trial. The prosecution argued that her dramatic display of grief was calculated, designed to make her appear as a devastated wife rather than a woman who had just committed murder. The defense, however, pointed to her immediate response as evidence of genuine shock and remorse, the reaction of someone who had acted in self-defense and was horrified by the unintended consequences. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do for Josh. The scene they encountered was traumatic. A young man's broken body surrounded by debris from the shattered window above, and his 19-year-old wife in apparent hysterics beside him. The police investigation began immediately. Amber was taken to the station for questioning, where she gave her initial account of what had happened. The interview, which would later be played for the jury, showed a young woman who appeared confused, frightened, and deeply shaken by the events. She maintained from the beginning that she had acted in self-defense, that Josh had been the aggressor, and that she had only pushed him to protect herself. But investigators began to notice inconsistencies in her story. The physical evidence at the scene didn't entirely align with her account of events. The pattern of the broken glass, the location where Josh's body was found, and witness statements all raised questions about exactly how the confrontation had unfolded. As the investigation progressed, more details emerged about the couple's turbulent relationship. Neighbors came forward with accounts of previous disturbances. Friends and family members were interviewed, revealing a complex picture of a marriage marked by mutual violence, substance abuse, and psychological manipulation. The case took on additional complexity when it was revealed that Amber was pregnant at the time of Josh's death. This detail would play a significant role in public perception of the case, with some viewing her as a young mother protecting herself and her unborn child, while others saw it as another manipulative element in her story. The pregnancy also raised questions about the timeline of events, and the couple's future plans. Had they been trying to reconcile? Was the baby planned? These questions would never be fully answered, but they added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating case. As the investigation continued, The prosecution began building their case for murder. They argued that the evidence showed Amber had deliberately pushed Josh through the window in a moment of rage, not self-defense. The force required to break through the tempered glass and propel a 23-year-old man through a high-rise window. They contended suggested premeditation and intent to cause serious harm. The defense team, led by attorney Jason Corns, prepared to argue that Amber had acted in self-defense against an abusive husband. They planned to present evidence of Josh's violent behavior, his substance abuse problems, and his history of threatening Amber. The protective order that Josh had filed would be explained as part of a pattern of mutual combat, not evidence of Amber's aggression. However, Amber's defense attorney, Jason Corns, had no experience conducting criminal defense when he took her case. But Hillberling told Dr. Phil she trusted him and knew him as a family friend. This inexperience would later be seen as a crucial factor in how the case was handled. Though at the time, Amber trusted the family friend who had agreed to represent her. The trial began in March 2013, nearly 2 years after Josh's death. The courtroom was packed with family members from both sides, media representatives, and curious observers drawn to what had become one of Tulsa's most sensational criminal cases. The proceedings would last several weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses, expert analysis of the physical evidence, and emotional appeals from both the prosecution and defense. Jurors saw 2 videotapes, one showing the crime scene and another of the interview Amber Hillberling did with police. The day her husband died, the crime scene footage was particularly difficult for everyone in the courtroom, showing Josh's broken body and the extensive damage caused by his fall. The prosecution's case focused heavily on the physical evidence. They brought in experts to testify about the force required to break through the window, the trajectory of Josh's fall, and the injuries he sustained. They argued that the evidence was inconsistent with Amber's claim of self-defense, suggesting instead that she had deliberately and forcefully pushed her husband to his death. Witness testimony proved crucial but conflicting. 2 witnesses testified Wednesday they saw Joshua Hillberling come out the window face first and upright. That contradicted other statements. The inconsistencies in witness accounts would become a recurring theme throughout the trial, highlighting the difficulty of reconstructing exactly what had happened in those crucial moments. The prosecution also presented evidence of Amber's behavior after Josh's death, arguing that her actions suggested guilt rather than grief. They pointed to inconsistencies in her statements to police and what they characterized as her manipulative behavior during the investigation. The defense strategy relied heavily on establishing Josh as the primary aggressor in their relationship. They presented evidence of his military discharge, his substance abuse, and previous incidents of domestic violence. Josh Hillberling's U.S. Air Force file details an incident in which he threw a plate at Amber and attempted to snap one of her breast implants. This evidence was intended to show the jury that Amber had legitimate reason to fear her husband and to act in self-defense. Expert testimony about domestic violence patterns was also presented, with the defense arguing that Amber's behavior was consistent with that of an abuse victim who had finally fought back. They emphasized her young age, just 19 at the time of the incident, and argued that she had been trapped in an abusive relationship with no other options. The defense also challenged the reliability of the physical evidence, bringing in their own experts to offer alternative interpretations of the scene. They argued that the window glass was defective or insufficiently strong, suggesting that less force than the prosecution claimed might have been sufficient to break through it. Amber Hillberling took to the witness stand, testifying on her own behalf in a Tulsa County District courtroom Friday. She's charged with second-degree murder in the death of her husband Joshua Hillberling nearly 2 years ago. Her testimony was one of the most anticipated moments of the trial. Hillberling was very soft-spoken when she testified and sometimes hesitant in her answers. A few times she was seen crying. She maintained her account of self-defense, describing Josh as increasingly violent and threatening in the hours leading up to his death. She testified about feeling trapped against the window and pushing back in fear for her life. However, her testimony also revealed some of the complexities in their relationship that made the case so difficult to parse. She acknowledged that their marriage had been troubled from the beginning, with both partners engaging in behavior that was destructive and sometimes violent. She admitted to her own anger and frustration with Josh, though she maintained that she had never intended to harm him seriously. The prosecution's cross-examination was aggressive, challenging Amber on the inconsistencies in her various accounts of the events. They highlighted changes in her story over time, and questioned whether her emotional responses during the testimony were genuine or calculated for the jury's benefit. One of the most damaging aspects of the prosecution's case was their ability to present evidence suggesting that Amber had been considering leaving Josh, but had been prevented from doing so by financial constraints and her pregnancy. They argued that rather than being trapped in an abusive relationship, she had been trapped by her circumstances and had chosen violence as a solution. The trial also featured extensive expert testimony about the window glass and building construction. One of them is a glass expert who believes that the glass used in the building complies with current standards for that type of building. This testimony was intended to counter the defense's argument that the window was defectively weak. The expert analysis revealed that while the glass met building codes, it was never designed to prevent someone from going through it if sufficient force was applied. The question became whether Amber had applied that force intentionally or whether Josh's own momentum, combined with her defensive push, had created the tragic results. Medical testimony about Josh's injuries provided some of the most difficult moments of the trial. The medical examiner testified about all the broken bones and internal injuries the man suffered in the fall. He said he couldn't say whether the man came out the window facing outward or inward. This uncertainty about Josh's positioning as he fell became crucial to determining whether Amber had pushed him or whether he had fallen as a result of their mutual struggle. The prosecution argued that the extensive nature of Josh's injuries, while tragic, was simply evidence of the height from which he fell, not necessarily indicative of the force with which he was pushed. They maintained that even a defensive push, if applied at the right moment and angle, could have sent him through the window. As the trial progressed, both sides presented character witnesses intended to support their narratives. Josh's family and friends testified about his love for Amber and his excitement about becoming a father. They painted him as a young man struggling with personal demons, but fundamentally good-hearted, and not capable of the level of violence that would justify deadly self-defense. Amber's supporters testified about Josh's controlling and abusive behavior, describing incidents they had witnessed or heard about. They portrayed Amber as a young woman trapped in a dangerous relationship, gradually isolated from friends and family by her husband's jealousy and possessiveness. The jury was faced with conflicting narratives and incomplete evidence. They had to decide whether to believe Amber's account of self-defense or the prosecution's argument that she had deliberately murdered her husband in a moment of rage. The physical evidence was ambiguous, the witness testimony was contradictory, and both versions of events seemed plausible given the known facts about the couple's troubled relationship. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Amber Hillberling was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. The conviction suggested that while the jury didn't believe Amber had planned Josh's death in advance, which would have resulted in a first-degree murder conviction, they also didn't accept her claim of self-defense. The sentencing was controversial, with many observers feeling that 25 years was excessive for a 19-year-old, with no prior criminal record, who claimed to be defending herself against an abusive husband. Others argued that the sentence was appropriate given the deliberate nature of the act that caused Josh's death. Amber's case became a cause célèbre for domestic violence advocates, who argued that she represented the thousands of women who were prosecuted for defending themselves against abusive partners. They pointed to the evidence of Josh's violent behavior and argued that the justice system had failed to recognize the reality of domestic abuse dynamics. However, Josh's family and supporters maintained that justice had been served. They argued that regardless of the problems in their marriage, Josh didn't deserve to die, and that Amber's actions had been motivated by anger rather than fear. They rejected the characterization of Josh as a monster, insisting that he was a troubled young man who was trying to improve his life. Years after Hillberling's conviction, Korn surrendered his law license after he was accused of bilking an elderly client out of $1.4 million in gifts, including a home worth more than $500,000. This development raised questions about the quality of Amber's representation during the trial, and whether her inexperienced attorney had provided adequate counsel. Hillberling told Dr. Phil that her parents asked her numerous times to fire Korns during her lengthy criminal proceedings, but she said she never did. This decision would later be seen as a crucial mistake that may have affected the outcome of her case. Amber's time in prison was marked by continued controversy. The Department of Corrections released a history of misconduct she was allegedly involved in over the years, suggesting that she struggled to adapt to prison life and maintain good behavior while incarcerated. The case took its final tragic turn in December 2016. Hillberling was found dead in her prison cell, in what was ruled a suicide. She was 25 years old, having spent 5 years in prison for her husband's death. Her death effectively ended any possibility of appeal or clemency, and left many questions about the case forever unanswered. Hillberling maintained she acted in self-defense during an argument, but a jury had found otherwise. Her death in prison meant that she would never have the opportunity to fully tell her story or see her sentence reconsidered in light of new understanding about domestic violence and self-defense. The Hillberling case remains a complex and troubling example of how domestic violence can escalate to deadly consequences. It raises difficult questions about the nature of self-defense, the dynamics of abusive relationships, and the challenge of determining guilt when both parties in a relationship have engaged in violent behavior. Was Amber Hillberling a victim who fought back against an abuser and accidentally caused his death? Or was she a calculating young woman who deliberately murdered her husband in a moment of rage? The evidence presented at trial was ambiguous enough to support both interpretations, highlighting the difficulty of reconstructing events that occurred behind closed doors between two people with a history of violence. The case also illustrates the tragic consequences that can result when domestic violence goes unaddressed. Both Josh and Amber showed signs of being trapped in a destructive cycle that neither seemed able to break. Josh's military file contained evidence of violent behavior, while Amber's actions on that June evening demonstrated her capacity for extreme violence when she felt cornered. The role of substance abuse in their relationship cannot be ignored. Josh's drinking problem and drug-related military discharge suggest that addiction played a role in the escalating violence between them. Amber's own behavior patterns, both before and after Josh's death, also raised questions about her mental health and decision-making capacity. The case highlights the inadequacy of existing systems for addressing domestic violence before it reaches deadly consequences. Despite evidence of mutual violence in their relationship, neither Josh nor Amber received effective intervention that might have prevented the tragedy. The protective order that Josh filed was apparently insufficient to address the underlying problems in their relationship. The physical setting of their confrontation, a high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows, created unique dangers that neither of them may have fully appreciated. The window glass, while meeting building codes, was not designed to prevent human bodies from passing through it under force. This architectural feature transformed what might have been a non-fatal domestic dispute into a deadly encounter. The public reaction to the case reflected broader debates about domestic violence, gender roles, and the criminal justice system's response to women who kill their partners. Amber's youth and pregnancy at the time of the incident generated sympathy from some quarters, while others focused on Josh's right to life regardless of his behavior in the marriage. The case also demonstrated the importance of quality legal representation in capital cases. Amber's defense attorney's lack of experience in criminal defense and his subsequent legal troubles raised questions about whether she received adequate representation during her trial. The complexity of domestic violence cases requires attorneys with specific expertise and experience that may not have been available to her. The tragic ending of Amber's life in prison adds another layer of sadness to an already devastating case. Her suicide at age 25 meant that she never had the opportunity to appeal her conviction, seek clemency, or benefit from evolving understanding of domestic violence dynamics. It also meant that Josh's family was denied the possibility of ever receiving a fuller accounting of what happened that night. The Hillberling case serves as a reminder of the complex factors that can contribute to domestic violence. Tragedies, economic stress, substance abuse, mental health issues, social isolation, and inadequate support systems all played roles in creating the circumstances that led to Josh's death. Understanding these factors is crucial for preventing similar tragedies in the future. The case also underscores the importance of early intervention in relationships showing signs of violence. Both Josh and Amber exhibited warning signs that their relationship was dangerous, but neither received effective help before it was too late. Better training for law enforcement, social services, and court personnel in recognizing and responding to domestic violence might have made a difference. The physical evidence in the case, the broken window, the trajectory of Josh's fall, the injuries he sustained, told a story that was open to multiple interpretations. This ambiguity highlights the challenge that juries face in domestic violence cases, where the only witnesses to the crucial events are often the victim and the defendant. The emotional evidence, the couple's history of violence, their troubled relationship, their individual struggles with addiction and mental health, was equally complex and open to different interpretations. Both Josh and Amber were flawed individuals caught in a destructive cycle that ultimately claimed both their lives. As we reflect on this tragedy, it's important to remember that behind the legal arguments and media coverage, were two young people whose lives ended far too soon. Josh Hillberling was 23 years old when he died. A former athlete with dreams and struggles like any young man, Amber Hillberling was 19 when she was convicted, and 25 when she died in prison, having spent her early adulthood behind bars. Their story serves as a sobering reminder that domestic violence affects people of all backgrounds and circumstances. It can escalate quickly and unpredictably, transforming relationships that began with love into situations of mortal danger. The warning signs are often present, but they may be missed or ignored until it's too late. The case also illustrates the importance of addressing the underlying issues that contribute to domestic violence. Addiction, mental health problems, economic stress, and social isolation. These factors don't excuse violent behavior, but understanding them is crucial for prevention and intervention efforts. For those who work in the criminal justice system, the Hillberling case provides important lessons about the complexity of domestic violence prosecutions. The evidence is often ambiguous, the witness testimony contradictory, and the legal questions challenging. These cases require careful investigation, experienced attorneys, and judges who understand the dynamics of abusive relationships. The case ultimately leaves us with more questions than answers. Was justice served by Amber's conviction and 25-year sentence? Should the jury have accepted her claim of self-defense? Did the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that her actions constituted murder rather than self-defense? These are questions that reasonable people can disagree about, even after examining all the available evidence. What we can say with certainty is that the events of June 7, 2011, represent a failure of multiple systems that are supposed to protect people from domestic violence. The couple's friends and family saw warning signs but didn't know how to intervene effectively. The military's response to Josh's violent behavior was inadequate. The legal system's protective order didn't prevent further violence. Social services apparently never became involved despite clear evidence of a troubled relationship. The tragedy of the Hillberling case extends beyond the courtroom to the families who lost loved ones. Josh's family lost a son, brother, and future father whose life was cut short just as he was trying to turn things around. Amber's family watched their daughter go to prison as a teenager and die there as a young woman, never having the chance to build a normal adult life. The unborn child that Amber was carrying at the time of Josh's death represents another victim of this domestic violence tragedy. That child never had the opportunity to know either parent, growing up instead with the knowledge that one parent killed the other and then died in prison years later. As true crime enthusiasts, we're often drawn to cases like this because they force us to grapple with difficult moral and legal questions. The Hillberling case doesn't offer easy answers or clear villains and victims. Instead, it presents us with a complex human tragedy that defies simple categorization. The case reminds us that domestic violence is rarely as straightforward as popular narratives suggest. Relationships can be mutually destructive, with both partners engaging in behavior that escalates conflict and creates danger. Understanding this complexity is important for developing more effective responses to domestic violence. The physical evidence in the case, the shattered window 25 floors above Tulsa streets, serves as a powerful symbol of how quickly a domestic dispute can turn deadly. The glass that was meant to provide a view of the city instead became the instrument of Josh's death, and the evidence that would send Amber to prison. The case also highlights the role that architecture and urban design can play in domestic violence outcomes. High-rise living, while offering many benefits, can also create unique dangers when relationships turn violent. The isolation of apartment living, combined with features like floor-to-ceiling windows, can transform domestic disputes into deadly encounters. As we conclude this examination of the Hillberling case, it's worth reflecting on what we can learn from this tragedy. The case demonstrates the importance of taking domestic violence seriously from the earliest warning signs. It shows how substance abuse and mental health issues can escalate relationship problems into deadly situations. It illustrates the complexity of determining guilt and innocence in cases where both parties have engaged in violent behavior. Most importantly, the case reminds us that behind every true crime story are real people whose lives were forever changed by violence. Josh Hillberling's family continues to mourn a son who will never come home. Amber Hillberling's family grieves a daughter who spent her final years in prison. The ripple effects of that June evening in 2011 continue to impact everyone who knew and loved both of them. The University Club Tower still stands in downtown Tulsa, its windows reflecting the Oklahoma sky as they did on that tragic night. But for those who remember the case, It will forever be marked by the events of June 7th, 2011, a reminder of how quickly love can turn to violence, and how the consequences of domestic abuse can echo through generations. In the end, the Hillberling case serves as both a true crime story and a cautionary tale about the dangers of domestic violence. It challenges us to look beyond simple narratives of guilt and innocence to understand the complex factors that contribute to these tragedies. And it reminds us that the work of preventing domestic violence requires all of us, family members, friends, communities, and institutions, to recognize warning signs and intervene before it's too late. The broken glass has been cleaned up, the legal proceedings have ended, and both Josh and Amber are gone. But their story continues to resonate as a powerful reminder of the human cost of domestic violence and the importance of addressing it before relationships reach the point of no return. In that way, perhaps their tragedy can serve some larger purpose, helping us understand how to prevent similar losses in the future and how to better support those caught in the cycle of domestic violence before it's too late. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet, rolling hills of East Texas, where the pace of life moves as slowly as the morning mist that settles over the pine trees, there once stood a modest cabin-style home that housed what appeared to be the picture-perfect American family. The year was 2008, and the Caffey family had built their life around faith, hard work, and the simple pleasures of rural living in Alba, Texas. A community so small that everyone knew everyone, and neighbors still looked out for one another. Terry Caffey, a 41-year-old man with calloused hands and a warm smile, worked long shifts to provide for his beloved family. His wife, Penny, was 38 years old, a devoted mother who had dedicated her life to raising their 3 children. Their home was filled with the sounds of laughter from their 2 young sons, 13-year-old Matthew, whom everyone affectionately called Bubba, and 8-year-old Tyler, whose boundless energy brought joy to everyone around him. And then there was Erin, their 16-year-old daughter, a teenager navigating the complex world of high school, first love, and the sometimes turbulent relationship between parents and their growing children. The Caffeys were deeply religious people, the kind who never missed church on Sunday and believed that family came before everything else. Terry worked as a security guard, often pulling 14-hour shifts to make ends meet, but he never complained. When he came home tired and worn, the sight of his family gathered around their dinner table was all the reward he needed. They weren't wealthy by any measure, but they were rich in the things that truly mattered: love, faith, and togetherness. But beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic family life, tensions were brewing that would ultimately lead to one of the most shocking crimes in Texas history. It started, as many teenage stories do, with romance. Erin Caffey, with her long brown hair and bright eyes, had caught the attention of an 18-year-old boy named Charlie Wilkinson. Charlie was older, and to Erin's teenage heart, that made him irresistibly appealing. He was the kind of boy who rode motorcycles, lived on his own, and represented everything that felt exciting and forbidden to a sheltered 16-year-old girl from a strict religious household. Their relationship began innocently enough, or at least it appeared that way on the surface. But as is often the case with first love, what started as innocent teenage infatuation quickly intensified into something much more consuming. Erin became completely enamored with Charlie, spending every free moment thinking about him, talking to him, or planning their next meeting. To her young mind, Charlie Wilkinson wasn't just her boyfriend. He was her entire world. Terry and Penny Caffey, however, weren't blind to what was happening. As loving parents, they watched their daughter's behavior change with growing concern. They noticed how Erin's mood would swing dramatically, based on whether she'd spoken to Charlie that day. They saw how she'd become secretive about her phone calls and text messages. Most troubling of all, they witnessed how their once obedient daughter had begun pushing boundaries and challenging their authority in ways she never had before. The Caffeys weren't unreasonable parents. They understood that their daughter was growing up, and that romantic relationships were a natural part of that process. But something about Charlie Wilkinson troubled them deeply. Perhaps it was his age. At 18, he was significantly older than their 16-year-old daughter. Maybe it was the way Erin seemed to lose herself completely when she was with him, abandoning the interests and friendships that had once been important to her. Or it could have been the subtle signs they picked up on that suggested Charlie's influence over their daughter was growing stronger every day. After many long conversations between husband and wife, Terry and Penny made the difficult decision that many parents face. They decided to intervene. They sat Erin down and explained their concerns about her relationship with Charlie. They told her they thought she was too young to be so serious with someone so much older. They worried that she was moving too fast, making decisions based on emotion rather than wisdom. Most importantly, they made it clear that while they loved her unconditionally, they didn't approve of her relationship with Charlie Wilkinson. For most teenagers, such parental disapproval might result in arguments, slammed doors, or perhaps some dramatic declarations about how unfair life is. But for Erin Caffey, her parents' intervention felt like nothing short of a declaration of war against her happiness. In her 16-year-old mind, her parents weren't just disapproving of her boyfriend. They were trying to destroy the most important thing in her life. What happened next would later shock investigators, prosecutors, and anyone who heard the story. Rather than accepting her parents' decision with the typical teenage angst and rebellion, Erin began plotting something far more sinister. In her mind, consumed by the intensity of first love and the drama that feels so overwhelming to teenage hearts, she convinced herself that the only way she could be with Charlie was if her parents were no longer part of the equation. But Erin's plan wasn't simply to run away or elope, as many star-crossed teenage lovers have done throughout history. Instead, she began nurturing thoughts that were as dark as they were unthinkable. She started to believe that her parents, and indeed her entire family, were obstacles that needed to be permanently removed from her life. Charlie Wilkinson, for his part, seemed all too willing to feed into these dangerous fantasies. Rather than being the mature adult in the relationship and talking Erin down from such extreme thoughts, he encouraged them. He listened as she vented about her parents' unreasonableness. He agreed when she painted them as villains who were trying to keep two people in love apart. And most dangerously of all, he began to take her increasingly violent suggestions seriously. It was during this time that Charlie introduced another player into their twisted drama, his friend Charles Wade. Wade was 20 years old, older than both Erin and Charlie, and had a history that included minor run-ins with the law. To Erin and Charlie, he seemed like someone who might be willing to help them with their increasingly desperate plan. As the weeks passed, what had started as angry teenage fantasies began to solidify into an actual plot. The three of them, Erin, Charlie, and Charles, began meeting in secret, discussing not just the possibility of eliminating Erin's family, but the specific details of how they would do it. They talked about weapons. They discussed timing. They considered what would happen afterward. What should have remained nothing more than the dramatic thoughts of an emotional teenager was instead being nurtured into something real and horrifying. There was also a fourth person who became involved in their planning. Bobby Johnson, Charlie's then-girlfriend. Yes, even as Charlie was planning to commit murder for Erin, he was also involved with another girl. This fact alone should have been enough to make Erin question Charlie's devotion to her. But she was too deep into her obsession to see the situation clearly. The plan they developed was as simple as it was brutal. They would wait until the Caffey family was asleep, break into the house, and kill everyone except Erin. She would be conveniently absent during the murders, giving her an alibi. Afterward, she and Charlie would be free to be together without any interference from her family. As February turned into March 2008, the plan moved from discussion to preparation. Charlie and Charles began gathering weapons, guns and knives that they would use to carry out their horrific mission. They studied the Caffey house, learning its layout and figuring out the best way to enter without being detected. They discussed which family member would be killed by whom, talking about the murder of innocent people as casually as they might discuss plans for a weekend trip. Erin, meanwhile, was tasked with making sure she wouldn't be in the house when the attack occurred. She was to arrange to spend the night elsewhere, creating distance between herself and the crime that would allow her to maintain her innocence when questioned by authorities. March 1st, 2008 was a Saturday. Terry Caffey had just finished another grueling 14-hour shift at his security job and arrived home after midnight, exhausted but grateful to be back with his family. He found his wife Penny already asleep, and their two boys, Bubba and Tyler, were also settled in for the night. Erin appeared to be staying over at a friend's house, which wasn't unusual for a teenager on a weekend. Terry went through his usual nighttime routine, checking the doors, turning off the lights, and finally settling into bed beside his wife. Outside, the Texas night was quiet and peaceful, with only the gentle sounds of nocturnal creatures and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. Inside the modest Caffey home, a family slept soundly, completely unaware that their lives were about to be shattered forever. At approximately 3:00 a.m., the silence was broken by the sound of breaking glass. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade had arrived at the Caffey home, armed with a .222 caliber pistol and a sword, weapons chosen not just for their lethality, but for their ability to kill quietly in the dark of night. Terry Caffey was awakened by the sound of gunshots. In that confused moment between sleep and consciousness, his mind struggled to make sense of what he was hearing. Were the sounds coming from outside? Was someone hunting? But as he became more fully awake, the horrible reality began to dawn on him. The sounds were coming from inside his house. Before he could fully process what was happening, Charlie Wilkinson appeared in the doorway of Terry and Penny's bedroom. The young man Terry had forbidden his daughter to see was standing in his home in the middle of the night, holding a gun. In that moment of recognition, Terry must have realized that this wasn't a random break-in or robbery gone wrong. This was something far more personal and terrifying. Charlie raised the gun and fired. The bullet struck Terry, but somehow miraculously it wasn't immediately fatal. Charlie fired again, and again and again. In total, Terry Caffey was shot 5 times at close range. Each shot should have been enough to kill him, but against all odds he remained conscious and alive. As Terry lay bleeding and in unimaginable pain, he could hear the sounds of violence continuing throughout his house. The killers weren't content to simply shoot their victims. They had also brought edged weapons to ensure their job was thorough and complete. In the boys' bedroom, 13-year-old Bubba and 8-year-old Tyler were awakened by the gunshots and the commotion. Terrified and confused, they cried out for their parents, asking what was happening. Young Tyler, in his fear and innocence, looked at the intruders who had invaded his home and asked a question that would haunt everyone who later heard about this case. "Why are you doing this?" It was a question that had no reasonable answer. Why were they doing this? Why were 2 grown men terrorizing and murdering small children? The boys posed no threat to anyone. They had done nothing wrong. Their only crime was being born into a family whose teenage daughter had become so obsessed with a boyfriend that she was willing to sacrifice everyone she should have loved most. Tyler's question went unanswered as Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade continued their brutal work. Both boys were stabbed multiple times with the sword they had brought. The violence was excessive and unnecessary. These weren't killers trying to silence witnesses quickly and move on. This was something much more personal and vengeful. Penny Caffey, Terry's beloved wife and the mother of the children being murdered in the next room, was also brutally killed in her bed. Like her sons, she was both shot and stabbed, the killers ensuring there was no possibility of survival. As Terry lay bleeding and listening to his family being slaughtered around him, he somehow found the strength to remain conscious. Perhaps it was adrenaline, or faith, or simply a father's desperate need to survive so he could seek justice for his murdered family. Whatever the reason, when Charlie and Charles believed they had killed everyone in the house, Terry was still clinging to life. But the killers weren't finished. Having murdered 3 members of the Caffey family, they now set about destroying the evidence of their crime. They poured gasoline throughout the house and set it ablaze, intending to burn down the home and destroy any forensic evidence that might lead investigators back to them. As the flames began to spread and smoke filled the house, Terry Caffey faced a choice that no human being should ever have to make. He was severely injured, having been shot 5 times, and the house around him was rapidly becoming an inferno. He could remain where he was and die alongside his family, or he could find the strength to save himself. Driven by an almost superhuman will to survive, Terry began crawling through his burning house toward what he hoped was safety. Every movement was agony, as his bullet wounds bled and his lungs filled with smoke. The heat from the fire was overwhelming, and the structure of the house was beginning to collapse around him. But somehow, inch by painful inch, he made his way through the flames and out of the house that had once been filled with love and laughter, but was now nothing more than a tomb for his murdered family. Once outside, Terry's ordeal was far from over. The nearest neighbor's house was 500 yards away, a distance that would be challenging for a healthy person to walk, let alone for someone who had been shot 5 times and was bleeding profusely. But Terry had no choice. If he remained where he was, he would bleed to death or die from smoke inhalation. His only hope was to reach help. The journey to his neighbor's house took Terry over an hour. He crawled most of the way, sometimes losing consciousness from pain and blood loss, only to force himself to wake up and continue. Behind him, his house continued to burn, and with it, the bodies of his wife and 2 young sons. The physical pain of his wounds was excruciating, but the emotional anguish of knowing his family was dead was even worse. When Terry finally reached his neighbor's house and collapsed on their doorstep, the people who found him could hardly believe what they were seeing. Here was a man who had been shot multiple times, his clothes burned and torn, barely alive but still conscious enough to tell them that his house was on fire and his family was inside. The emergency call went out just after 4:30 a.m. Charles Dickerson, the only officer on duty for the Rains County Sheriff's Office that night, received the call and immediately headed toward the scene. Firefighters and paramedics were also dispatched, but by the time they arrived, the Caffey house was already completely engulfed in flames. Terry was rushed to the hospital where doctors worked frantically to save his life. He had been shot in the face, neck, and torso and had lost an enormous amount of blood. By all medical logic, he should have died multiple times over, from the gunshots, from the blood loss, or from smoke inhalation. But somehow he was still alive. As firefighters worked to control the blaze at the Caffey house, they made the grim discoveries that Terry had already told them they would find. The burned remains of Penny Caffey and her 2 young sons were found in their bedrooms, victims of both gunshot wounds and stab wounds. The medical examiner would later confirm that all 3 had died before the fire reached them, meaning they had been murdered in their beds as they slept. In the initial hours after the attack, investigators weren't sure what they were dealing with. The obvious assumption was that the Caffey family had been the victims of a home invasion robbery gone wrong. Perhaps burglars had broken in, expecting to find an empty house, and had panicked when they encountered the sleeping family. But as investigators began to piece together the evidence, a different picture started to emerge. This hadn't been a random crime or a robbery attempt. The attackers had come specifically to kill the Caffey family, and they had brought the weapons necessary to do so. Moreover, there was one member of the family who was conspicuously absent from the house during the attack: 16-year-old Erin Caffey. When investigators tried to locate Erin to inform her of the tragedy and ensure her safety, they discovered she was staying with friends and appeared to be unharmed. Initially, this seemed to confirm her innocence. Surely she was just a lucky teenager who had been spared by being away from home when killers struck. But as the investigation continued, inconsistencies began to emerge in Erin's story. Her behavior didn't seem quite right for someone who had just learned that her entire family had been murdered. She seemed more concerned about other things than devastated by her loss. And when investigators began looking into her recent activities and relationships, they discovered the troubled romance between Erin and Charlie Wilkinson that her parents had tried to end. The breakthrough in the case came when Charlie Wilkinson himself was arrested. Under questioning, he eventually confessed not just to participating in the murders, but to planning them alongside Erin Caffey herself. According to Charlie, the entire attack had been Erin's idea. She was the one who had suggested killing her family so they could be together. She was the one who had provided information about the house layout and family routines. She was the mastermind behind the entire plot. This revelation shocked everyone involved in the investigation. It was one thing to imagine that a teenage girl might run away with her boyfriend against her parents' wishes, or even that she might fantasize about being free of parental control, but to actually orchestrate the murder of her own mother and innocent little brothers was almost beyond comprehension. Charles Wade, when he was arrested, corroborated Charlie's story. Both young men insisted that while they had carried out the actual killings, the plan had originated with Erin. They claimed she had manipulated them into believing that her family was abusive and that killing them was somehow justified. She had convinced them that once her family was gone, she and Charlie would inherit money and property that would allow them to start a new life together. The 4th conspirator, Bobby Johnson, was also arrested and charged. Her role in the plot appeared to be more peripheral. She had known about the plan and had failed to report it to authorities, but hadn't directly participated in the murders. When Erin herself was finally arrested and charged with capital murder, the community of Alba, Texas was stunned. This wasn't some troubled teenager from a broken home or someone with a history of violence. This was a girl from a loving religious family who had somehow become so obsessed with her teenage boyfriend that she had been willing to sacrifice her entire family for him. The case raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of teenage psychology, the power of obsessive love, and the influence that older partners can have over impressionable young people. How does a 16-year-old girl go from being a seemingly normal teenager to plotting the murder of her own family? What warning signs had been missed? Could this tragedy have been prevented? During the legal proceedings that followed, more details about the plot emerged. Investigators learned that Erin had been actively involved in every aspect of the planning. She had drawn diagrams of her house for the killers. She had told them where each family member would be sleeping. She had arranged to be away from home during the attack. She had even discussed with them what she would say to police afterward to maintain her innocence. Perhaps most chillingly, Erin had shown no remorse for her actions. Even after being confronted with the evidence against her, she seemed more concerned about the consequences she would face than about the fact that her mother and little brothers were dead. She appeared to view herself as the victim in the situation, someone whose parents had been unreasonably cruel in trying to separate her from her boyfriend. The trials that followed were emotionally devastating for everyone involved. But perhaps most of all for Terry Caffey. Here was a man who had already suffered the unimaginable trauma of watching his family being murdered, and barely surviving the attack himself. Now he had to face the additional horror of learning that his own daughter, the child he had loved and raised and worked so hard to provide for, had been the architect of it all. Terry's testimony during the trials was heart-wrenching. He described the night of the attack in detail, reliving the moments when he heard gunshots in his house, when he realized his family was being killed, when he made the agonizing decision to save himself by crawling through the burning wreckage of his home. But perhaps more difficult than recounting the physical trauma was grappling with the emotional reality of his daughter's betrayal. In the end, justice was served, though it could never truly compensate for the enormity of the loss. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bobby Johnson received a lesser sentence for her more limited role in the conspiracy, and Erin Caffey, despite her age, was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for her role as the mastermind behind the murders. But for Terry Caffey, the legal resolution of the case was only the beginning of a much longer journey. He had survived the physical attack, but now he faced the challenge of rebuilding his life after losing everything that had given it meaning. His wife was gone, his sons were gone, his home was gone, and his daughter, the child who should have been his greatest source of comfort during such a tragedy, was the one responsible for destroying everything he had loved. In the years that followed, Terry's story became one not just of survival, but of something even more remarkable: forgiveness. Despite everything that had happened, despite the enormity of the betrayal and loss he had experienced, Terry found it in his heart to forgive those who had wronged him so terribly. He forgave Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade for pulling the triggers and wielding the weapons that killed his family. He even forgave his daughter, Erin, for orchestrating the entire plot. This forgiveness didn't come easily or quickly. It was the result of Terry's deep faith and his belief that holding on to anger and hatred would only compound the tragedy that had already occurred. He realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had been done or minimizing the horror of the crimes. Instead, it was about freeing himself from the burden of carrying that hatred and allowing himself to find some measure of ease. Terry eventually remarried and found love again, though he has never forgotten his first family or stopped mourning their loss. He has spoken publicly about his experience, not to relive the trauma, but to share his message of forgiveness, and to help others who have experienced similar tragedies understand that healing is possible, even after the most devastating losses. The Caffey family murders remain one of the most shocking crimes in Texas history, not just because of the brutality of the attacks, but because of the betrayal at the heart of the case. It's a story that challenges our assumptions about family loyalty, teenage psychology, and the lengths to which people will go when consumed by obsessive love. The case also serves as a tragic reminder of how quickly teenage infatuation can escalate into something dangerous when it's not properly guided by mature adults. Erin Caffey's obsession with Charlie Wilkinson might have remained nothing more than typical teenage drama if the adults in her life, particularly Charlie himself, had acted responsibly. Instead, what should have been a learning experience about love and relationships became a tragedy that destroyed multiple lives. In the quiet hills of East Texas, where the Caffey family once lived and loved and dreamed of the future, there is now only memory. The house where Penny made breakfast for her family each morning is gone, reduced to ashes and grief. The bedrooms where Bubba and Tyler slept, surrounded by toys and books and all the innocent possessions of childhood, exist now only in the hearts of those who remember them. But perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps the real legacy of the Caffey family isn't in the tragedy that befell them, but in the love they shared before that terrible night in March 2008. Perhaps it's in Terry's remarkable journey toward forgiveness and his determination to find meaning and purpose despite his devastating loss. Perhaps it's in the reminder that even in our darkest moments, even when faced with betrayals and losses that seem too great to bear, there is still the possibility of healing, of rebuilding, and of choosing love over hatred. The story of the Caffey family murders is ultimately a story about the complexity of human nature, our capacity for both great love and terrible betrayal, our ability to create and to destroy, our power to forgive even when forgiveness seems impossible. It's a story that reminds us that the people we love most have the power to hurt us most deeply, but also that love itself, Real, mature, selfless love can survive even the darkest of tragedies. As we close this tragic chapter of true crime history, we're left with questions that have no easy answers and lessons that come at too high a price. We're reminded of the preciousness of family, the danger of obsession, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Most of all, we're reminded that even in a world where such terrible things can happen, there is still hope, still healing, and still the possibility that love can triumph over hate. The Caffey family murders stand as a testament to both the worst and the best of human nature. The capacity for unthinkable evil and the equally remarkable capacity for forgiveness and healing. In remembering this story, we honor not just the victims who died, but the survivor who chose to live, to forgive, and to find meaning in the midst of devastating loss. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.